Yeah, I'm happy to start. Oh yeah, I just seal them with glue and silk. Sorry. Important. That's our first all-woman board meeting impact there. Um, Good morning. Sorry for starting a little bit late. Steve Moore will be joining us probably in about 10 minutes from now, but we're going to get started. Good morning. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board, and it is July 6th at 9:05, and the meeting's called to order. With me, to my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Dee Dee Adamo, and as I said, Board Member Stephen Moore will be apparating to my right in a few minutes. Mr. Howard, will you introduce the staff that's assisting today?
Thank you. To my left, Chief Counsel Michael Laufer. To my right, Chief Deputies John Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer. And assisting the board today is Janine Townsend.
Emergency evacuation procedures for the building. For any of you who don't know, look for the exit sign nearest you, and if you hear an emergency sound, grab your things, your friends, and proceed cautiously out of the building. We gather in Cesar Chavez Park at the corner of J and 10th. If you want to stay with us to know when it's time to come back, that's the place to go. The meeting's being webcast and recorded, and so it is important when you're at the microphone to be close enough that it's picked up, but not so close that you get a static pop or whisper. That's a little hard to, you'll know it when you see it when you're up there or you feel it. And please, if you have any noise-making devices of any kind, put them on silent or stun, just out of courtesy to everybody. Although occasionally Siri wants to make a comment, and if it's interesting enough, I'll let it in. We're on to the public forum portion of the meeting. The board hears from anyone who wants to talk on something not on the agenda. Do we have any speakers? Okay, something that's quite interesting and important. Next, we have the minutes of the June 21st and 22nd board meetings. I'll entertain a motion.
So moved on both. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, that carries. We have one uncontested item. It's still uncontested. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thanks for the work you did on that, John, and the team. Appreciate that. Team, sorry you don't get to talk. I know you know, you're fine, but appreciate that. All right, let's move to item number 3, the update on the emergency water conservation regulation. Hi. Some nice news today.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. Yelena Hartman, Senior Scientist at the Office of Research Planning and Performance, and Jasmine Oaxaca from the Office of Enforcement. We are presenting today a monthly update on the emergency water conservation, focusing on May 2016 results. And the data we are presenting have been released and are posted on our website on the conservation portal under the reporting tab. May was a big month in multiple ways. It marks 1 year anniversary since emergency water conservation regulation have been in effect with various extensions and adjustments. We also have 2 years of water production data that urban suppliers have reported to us. And probably the biggest thing to remark about May 2016 is that Californians saved 28.2% compared to the May 2013, which is our baseline for assessing conservation. And so we are looking at 12-month cumulative savings of 24.5%, which is great. And it also ends the conservation standards as we've had them so far, effective on June 1st, and so reported at the next board meeting will be conservation under the conservation standards that are based on the self-certification of supply, or also called stress test conservation standards.
But we'll still be reporting the monthly averages the same way.
Yes, we will. We will
How
be
people are
looking at
doing.
that and other pieces of information.
I think 28. It's pretty awesome. It's great.
It's wonderful.
Great 28.
Yes. So
He's a poet.
So this chart here shows in purple bars monthly percent reduction compared to 2013 water production, and orange line is showing cumulative savings. And so for May 2016, Californians saved 28.2%, and so that's an increase in percent savings compared to the previous month, and cumulative savings are 24.5%. Looking back and comparing the statewide water usage in 2016 and 2013, Californians have decreased their residential per capita consumption per day. So in May 2016, that was 87 gallons per capita per day, and that's 34 gallons better than 2013. So great savings.
How did do you have information, you may not before you, but how May 16 compared to previous years on temperature?
May is very similar in 2016 compared to 2013. It was ever so slightly cooler. So statewide average about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's a lot of regional variability, and it was 7/100ths of an inch wetter. So ever so slightly more precipitation, but of course this is not evenly distributed, and these savings are remarkable. So with the amount of water saved in May, which was 57.7 million gallons, we are looking at total savings over 224 billion gallons, or approximately 1.6 million acre feet saved. And if we're assuming that a family of 5 uses 1 acre foot of water per year, that's enough water to supply 21% of California's population with water for 1 year, or 8 million people. I think Jasmine can give us an update on the enforcement.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. I just have a few words today on enforcement, very brief. So as you can see, March through May data is roughly the same, again with the jump in compliance due to the revised standards that went into effect in March. And compliance will continue to be evaluated each month, and we expect to see leaps and bounds in compliance improvement when the self-certified standards go into effect for June, for next month. A few other points to touch on. For the 11 suppliers with conservation orders and the 7 with alternative compliance orders, discussions are already underway to evaluate and assess the applicability of the orders moving forward, especially for those that self-certified. Almost all of them did, with the exception of 3 suppliers.
Yeah, and in fact, maybe this is a good place since both of you are here. I was talking to some environmental representatives from Southern California, and they were particularly concerned about those 11 that fell into the what do you call it, violation category, and and then the self-certification that they were okay, that they had enough water for the next, that they could project that they had enough water for this year, and based on all the formulas that we had. And they were expressing some concern that there might be some things that need to be looked at more closely. So I assume both of you will be taking that back to your offices and doing more close evaluation of particularly these groups, or this group, and maybe others.
Yes, so we do plan to meet or have a conference call with each of them, and we will discuss whether it makes sense to keep particular directives within the orders, or if we find that they are now meeting those directives, then we would take those away or perhaps rescind the entire order. So it'll be based on an evaluation collaboratively with.
But it could go the other way as well. I guess that's the concern that people were expressing. They weren't worried about us pulling away restrictions, but would we put restrictions on if there was a need? That was
our goal is to have compliance assistance with these groups, with these districts. And we do plan to evaluate their programs with them. And if there is something that they do want to implement, we can certainly help them with that.
Trust but verify. They're concerned about the verify part. That's the question.
So I would just add, in general, we're going to be going through the data that we received and just doing some validation, making sure it was, provided consistent with what was in the regulation and that the numbers are reasonable. So we'll definitely take a closer look at the suppliers that are under either a conservation ordinance or conservation order or any kind of other enforcement order by the board.
That's correct. So for the 4 administrative civil liabilities issued last fall, I just wanted to mention those. So Beverly Hills had paid their penalty, and for the other 3, we accepted proposals for supplemental environmental projects that went above and beyond what was required by the regulation, and with the added benefit of keeping the funds locally and improving the conservation programs within those communities. So stipulated orders are now in effect for Coachella Valley Water District and India Water Authority, and they are starting to report their progress monthly against what they have proposed to us. And the public comment period for the City of Redlands settlement agreement will end on July 20th. And with that, I will pass it back to Yelena to talk about the self-certification.
I will outline the next steps as has been already touched, and I just want to reiterate, we are taking the approach of trust but verify, and it's going to take us a little bit of time to review. There is a whole team of people looking at the information we have received during the process of self-certification. As compliance priorities reflect ability of suppliers to meet their conservation standards as they were, that does not necessarily mean that they are going to face shortages, assuming 3 additional years of drought. So we will follow submissions and verify whether they meet the assumptions that were in the regulation, because the May 2016 emergency regulation allowed an option to self-certify supply under the assumption of 3 additional years of drought, mirroring certain water years, or suppliers had an option to keep their existing standard. And so we had a combination of requirements that went to the wholesalers that projected what supply they're going to be able to deliver to their urban water suppliers. And that information was due on June 15th. And then urban water suppliers who wished to self-certify their supply and have the stress test determine their conservation standard starting with June 2016 going through January 2017 had to provide information. So some suppliers could opt to retain their standard. Anyone self-certification that gets evaluated and rejected would revert back to the previous conservation standard. So we have a whole team of people working on this. It will take us through this month to really be able to process these carefully. And so, yes, it's a complex situation right now, but we will continue to monitor conservation savings and report just the way we have so far going forward, and we will also watch for the water supply going forward.
On that point, with the new data that are being reported and gone through at this early stage, do you foresee the ability to track water supply? Are you getting enough specificity in the analyses for self-certification that, like we've been able to track water conservation, do you think we'll be able to, in parallel, produce some sort of estimate of water supply over time?
Suppliers are not required to report to us their supply other than during the process of self-certification where they projected what their supplies would be. So any ones that raise any sort of flag, we will be looking to work with those suppliers more closely if there are answers to be found or something of concern to track.
One area also, as we look at, we're trying to create some sort of worst case scenario with the 3 years of drought. But actually, in terms of water supply reliability, a water supplier is going to look beyond 3 years. That is, the 4th year, if you're at the end of 3 years of serious drought, what's left in the tank for the coming year? Are you looking at assumptions about that reserve of water supply that should be built into this analysis?
Yes, basically the emergency regulation that was adopted in May did require suppliers to really come out what's in the tank at the end of the 3 years, and whatever that shortfall is compared to the demand that was set conservatively is what the conservation standard under the stress test is through January 2017. Of course, long-term conservation regulation are in development, so what we are going to have in effect later on.
Right, it's a test for what we do this year, not a test for what they should be doing 3 years. Yeah. Right.
Board Member Moore. So just to elaborate on that, there are a couple other things that are going on as you're aware. First off, the updated urban water management plans are now submitted to the Department of Water Resources. So those have a longer look, and DWR will be going through those, and we'll be looking at those as well. And then those will help to inform the work that jointly the board and DWR are doing under the executive order that the governor issued back in May to look at long-term efficiency standards and update drought planning, which is a critical element of that order. So we'll be getting there as we do this work.
Great news, and it'll be interesting to comb through. I haven't done it yet, but I'll do it, which cities are doing what, because some of our folks that were laggards are now doing really well as you look at the numbers, and others we'll see if they start tailing off. I think the public so far gets it. Saving water is a smart thing.
Yeah, and the April and May numbers are inspiring, and they show that the Californians understand the severity of this drought and are continuing to save. And for what it's worth, 24.5, you round that up to 25 for the year.
Well, you're the math guy.
Yeah. So
I'm
that's
just
a round
waiting till
up.
that
Significant
bucket hits 25, and then we have a drink or something. I don't know.
I think it did. I mean, that was the end of the year. And think of significant digits and, in our confidence in that number. So I'll go with the 25. We saved 1 drop in 4, it's a significant achievement for our
Yeah,
state.
I just like the ongoing, yes, that's good.
We
That
have,
bucket is good.
we have different, the professors up here have different grading approaches.
I'm going to wait till we actually hit it, and then I'm going to have a drink, neat, without ice.
I treat.
Yeah.
Cold
right,
water.
Perfect, yeah, exactly. No, it will not be water. I have something else in mind. That's right. We have one speaker card, Jack Hawks, California Water Association. No, thanks, and thanks for
Board
coming up to
members.
talk about this.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
I just want to give a quick report on what the California Public Utilities Commission did. They had a meeting on June 23rd. They actually considered two options for their resolution that applies to the IOUs, the regulated IOUs. And the first option was simply to comport with the Water Board's emergency regulation verbatim. Second option was different, though. Second option was to do the self-certification. But if the self-certification was lower than your current mandatory standard as amended back in March, you were to take the higher of. And they had a spirited discussion. You know, Bagley-Keene prevents them from talking with each other prior to these meetings as well. So we, in the audience, weren't quite sure what was going to happen completely. We had visited the commissioners the week before to talk about this. Anyway, they had a spirited discussion, and they were actually fairly concerned about, you know, the drought numbers that you all hear, you see in the reports every month, and there was some significant support for option B is what it was, and that was in effect to stay with your mandatory standards. In the end, as you know, Commissioner Sandoval, Catherine Sandoval, is the water lead, and she's been the water lead on the PUC for the last 6 years. She kind of carried the day at the conversation. And at the end of the day, the commissioners decided that the regulated utilities should not be that far out of step with their public agency counterparts, especially since they're right next to each other. So they ended up adopting their resolution, it's W5103, to adopt the emergency regulation as you passed it on May 18th or whatever the day was. And so our guys went ahead and did their self-certifications as well, but all of them have maintained what I would call a strong voluntary target of between 10 and 20% for the next 7 months until we get to January. So I just wanted to report on how that vote turned out. So, okay.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the next few months they'll be a little more complex, but the point of it is not to say you shouldn't be conserving. The point of it is to say, do we need top-down state standards? And we'll see. But it's a chance to let folks go back to the setting it themselves. It is more complicated in the CPUC context because they have to get approval from the CPUC for everything. But presumably the CPUC will support whatever they're doing. And conservation just makes good business sense too. So it's a smart thing to do if you can work your rate structure appropriately, which hopefully lots of agencies are working on right now. It's the responsible thing to be doing. And we'll see. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, whether with a target or just conservation rules about how often you can water and all of that, which can yield benefits. And then the question will be what kind of advertising people are doing to encourage folks to conserve. So it'll be a more complex few months, but hopefully still strong.
And the CPUC, I just want to thank you again as well for coming in and reporting on as to what happened. Oh, gracious, I maybe it was 8 or 9, maybe even 10 years ago, but 8 or 9 years ago, the CPUC voted to separate rates from water volume. And this idea had been active in energy for years. And so they adopted it. And so actually the PUC agencies are probably in as good or better shape than most everyone else in being able to handle a drought. And so it's really, we should be learning from the PUC and their experiences. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that. Good news. That's good. Number 4, California's, this is our regular update on drought actions, starting with staff, our staff.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, board members. Darren Polhemus, Deputy Director, Division of Financial Assistance, and with me this morning is Damon Badgel, my senior for the Clean Abatement Account. We're going to give you an update on the funding we've done, the emergency drought funding from the Cleanup and Abatement Account and others. It'll kind of be a catching up to do since we haven't done any of these reports, so it'll cover kind of the whole breadth of the drought response we've had to get us to this point, and then we're planning to do kind of regular updates as we go along as things change to keep you informed. So, and with that, Dim.
Morning, board members, Chair Marcus. So with the end of the fiscal year, which also marked the end of the encumbrance deadline for some of the drought funding that we've been administering for the last 2 years, I'm here to give you an update basically on the funds that we've committed over the last 2 years, as well as funding that's been appropriated for this fiscal year in the new budget, as well as board items that we intend to bring for your consideration in the near future. I guess we don't have a clicker. So we've committed a total of over $28 million to about 140 projects, which we've broken down into 6 categories here on the slide. You can notice that a good portion of this funding went towards drilling new wells and repairing of wells, as well as supplying bottled water to disadvantaged communities. In addition, we've funded other variety of projects, including consolidating water systems when it was cost effective to do so, installing water storage tanks, point of use devices, water vending machines, and even in some cases offsetting water rates.
More widespread than I would have thought. It's interesting.
Right.
I've used a version of this map in drought updates to folks around the state, and it really conveys the statewide breadth of the challenge. On consolidation, could you explain a little bit more about what those type of expenses are? Are they infrastructure? Is there any administrative assistance that we provide?
So in most cases for consolidations, we usually do, like half a mile of pipe or something along those lines. So if it was longer than half a mile, we would most likely tell them to, go through the SRF program. In the meantime, we can supply them with bottled water or some sort of interim solution. So the costs usually, they're less than $500,000 for things like that. I've even seen costs as low as $100,000 for a consolidation. Where it's literally down the street, or they're just connecting to a main line right adjacent to the property.
I could add in, so one of the observations I've noted in these are all small, and a lot of our consolidations have been like hooking up the school that was right next to the community that had its own well and was its own public system, and now they're hooked into the small community one, which still is probably pretty small, but at least is more than just a school. There's definitely this wide range, the drought conservation that you were just talking about in the item before with the larger entities that are doing pretty well. We're talking about everything here is all on the small end spectrum and, with no reserves and one well often relying on. And so they have nothing to conserve or be able to report a different supply. So it is the other end of the spectrum.
Also, I just wanted to update you that as of last week, we've executed 3 agreements with nonprofit organizations for administering the $5 million that the board approved in December 2015 for assisting individual households in small water systems. And that was a huge effort, and we're just happy that we were able to execute those agreements, and that funding is available now for folks to apply through the nonprofits.
Which nonprofits?
So those nonprofits include RCAC, which is the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and self-help enterprises, as well as CRWA, or the California Rural Water Association. So this $28 million that we've committed in projects, it comes from two main sources. The one is the Public Water System Drought Emergency Response, or we refer to it as PWSDR funding. Previously, it was administered by California Department of Public Health. And also AB 91, which appropriated funding for addressing drought-related emergencies and contaminated drinking water supplies with the amendment to the Budget Act of 2014. So out of the $15 million that was originally allocated to the PWSDR program, we've committed over $14.9 million. So that left about 54 some odd $1,000 in uncommitted funds, which was reverted back to the general fund. And also for AB 91, which allocated $19 million in total, we've committed about $3.7 million out of the $4 million allocation for contaminated water supplies, as well as we've committed $9.3 million out of the $15 million for drought-related emergencies. And any uncommitted funding for AB 91 reverted back to the cleanup and abatement account.
A question there, and I know you've been working on this, so this is largely as a catch-up for me. Most of the funds here are for drought-related emergencies, but there are other kinds of emergencies that occur to very small systems that don't have reserves. And so how do those get taken care of? Because there was some concern among some of the drinking water folks. They get a call on Saturday and somebody is without water because a pipe broke or whatever, and it wasn't drought related.
So if it wasn't drought related, I mean, we have the Prop 84 funding program in the DFA, which is administered through a different unit. So that really doesn't have a drought criteria. So, I mean, those funds can be used for other emergencies that are non-drought related.
So let me add to that. I think part of your question may have been, we do the contamination one, which is the middle row there in the table before you, right, which is one of the ways it can be drought related, but it can be just contamination as well that, could be exacerbated by the drought. Then there's the emergencies that are just, something failed mechanically or whatever, it's not drought related. Those we're having a bit of a hard time with now. We had money from previous propositions that CDPH administered as just pure emergency, and they would come rushing in when anybody had any kind of failure, regardless of the financial status of the district. When we adopted our cleanup and abatement rules, we put a restriction on there that limited it to disadvantaged communities only. And I have now faced struggling with several communities that are not disadvantaged that have come in for this issue. So it's something we need to think about as a policy going forward. There's some options we'll try to prepare to look at. One of them is, do we want to have some kind of, quick small loan program? These communities maybe just don't have the cash to deal with it at the moment, and so we can float them a 5 or 7 year loan type of thing that they can fix the pump and then move forward with and pay us back because they, are a well-off community and really don't need the subsidy. And balancing that then with the, the incentives that we send, right? So personally, I think there was kind of some of the wrong incentives, which was, well, the state's always here to rescue you. So keep your rates as low as you can at the hairy to edge, don't carry a reserve, and we'll fly in to the rescue. And that's, a bit of a problem when you get to situations that the drought has stressed a lot of communities into, a lot of these smaller systems that, really should have been responsible in carrying a reserve. So we're going to work to try to find a balance there and see if we can't maybe develop some kind of loan program or something. It's a bit of a struggle. Our funding is not really set up that way. Cleanup abatement account, typically, the way we did it for drought, we said that we weren't going to basically make people pay back, because under our normal cleanup abatement account, we do try to seek funds for return when it's available, and we can seek those. So we'll look at that as we adopt going forward.
point about incentives, it's not only having reserves as a responsible entity, but also having an asset management program where you're really paying attention to infrastructure and keeping the failures from occurring through responsible oversight and a regular program of upkeep.
Right, sort of along the same lines, the concern about, many of these communities that don't have the technical, managerial, financial capacity, in light of the fact that this is, more of a drought response going into disadvantaged communities in particular. How are you seeing things play out now that the funding is there? Are you seeing that there are challenges with management or, some of the concerns that we've been looking at?
Yeah, it's only strengthened my resolve that we need to consolidate as much as we can these small systems with the larger ones for all of those reasons. There are just so many of these small systems that really are, flying by the seat of their pants or one pump failure away from no water in the entire system that, are out there. And, it's a broad systemic type of thing. Cindy Forbes and I have both been, trying to work together on this to address it as best we can. Our funding from our bigger funding programs is addressed at consolidation and trying to incentivize that. And with the new IUP you adopted, you included an incentive as well in the SRF loan program for the big guys that they could get up to $5 million at 0% interest for anything they wanted to do if it also involved a consolidation. So, along those lines, that's really the key I see. And, every time we turn around, there is another district that's on the verge of, collapse or something. And a lot of these, to be honest, are county systems, county operated, that are little sub-entities, a county water district. And, even though the technical facilities may be there at the county because they have an engineering department, they're run as independent enterprises under the county, and they don't have the resources to basically even pay the county staff to do the work or something. So it's the full breadth.
That's on the water side. Is there a wastewater corollary to that too?
It's not nearly as bad. I mean, we always knew it wasn't as bad. Wastewater tends to be kind of starting at a larger size of community where it's put into place. So it's nearly not the breadth of this. And I think it, sewering entities is a little bit higher lift, so it kind of drives an economy of scale at a starter level, a little different than drilling a well and putting in some pressure pipes, right? So there's some kind of just technical barriers there that seem to make it be at a different size. Now that being said, I know there are a lot of communities that are on septic tank that are on these systems that probably need to be switched over, and we need to be able to push wastewater down into those lower, smaller communities and get them off of their septic tanks and the potential problems that poses. And that's certainly what we'll see more of in the future.
What type of opportunity did you have, in interacting with some of these communities in light of the fact that for the most part, it sounds like we're talking about Band-Aids for a lot of these communities. So when you're out there, do you use it as an opportunity to talk consolidation and more of a long-term approach? And just sort of looking at the map, I mean, what's your sense of possibilities for more long-term solutions when you look at the dots on the map?
Yeah, across the breadth of all our programs, including the one Damon's running for claim abatement, the very first thing we look at is who's your neighbor, and Google Earth is our friend when it comes to figuring out how close they are to other systems, and the district engineers as well usually know when there's somebody next door, and we're already down that path. And we have no problem spending a larger amount of money now to get them hooked up, rather, even if it might be a cheaper solution may present itself, but then not, propose a long-term type of fix. So that's definitely in the cards. We are working with them as best we can to try to provide them, a more permanent solution. We should have mentioned as well that this program is not in isolation, right? We're working with Cal OES and Department of Water Resources. The three of us as our partners on all of the drought activities, and our funding applies in different ways, and we coordinate that amongst ourselves so that we can address kind of the holistic set of community needs associated with it. And so it's what we're seeing is kind of pretty much everything you can imagine. I guess I was heartened a little bit the other day by some communities that are not even next door to each other. They're in the same county, but they're miles and miles apart. and in conjunction with our nonprofit technical assistance providers that are helping the 3 communities, they on themselves thought of a managerial consolidation, which wasn't talked, we've been talking about it, but we haven't really forced anybody into it, and they kind of are approaching that on their own, which I found really heartening to think that someone might actually start to see that on their own and help us in that fashion. So that was a very positive sign. It's one, but I'm going to take that victory and make sure that they are able to pull it off.
I'd love to hear an update on that. I mean, we all would, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, as it gets some legs, I mean, it's in the talking stages now, we'll definitely bring it back to you as a
Yeah,
project.
if you look at the long-term trajectory, as we keep discovering new compounds that need to be treated for, the economy of scale becomes really important.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, it's just expensive to treat to modern standards, and the answer is not to treat,
Right.
which is sometimes what the argument ends up being. But we all actually want as clean a water as we can manage technically, feasibly, economically, and when you get an economy of scale, it becomes an economy of scale. So.
I'd be interested, thank you, that's a very good point. I'd be real interested in, and I appreciate this item because you know, there are a lot of questions out there about, you know, the funding and where the relief has been and all that, and all these detailed, complex stories that you've touched on. I'm real interested, I believe SB 88, and it was sort of a milestone, you know, where we took it up a notch as far as working more proactively around the state. I'd be interested over time in really showing a performance metric on this, because one of the stories of California in other audiences, you know, beyond, outside of the state boundary is, you know, the over 7,500 independent public water systems. And I think one of the stories we want to tell over the next 5-10 years is how the 7,500 is transformed into something else. You know, is it gone down in 10 years of effort to 7,400? Or have we actually, you know, done some institutional work and sharpened our pencils and really reorganized to protect public health and the environment in a lot more responsible way, less fragmented way? So, you know, I want to put this in the back of your mind and my fellow board members' mind that we should be looking at this as, you know, what kind of trajectory are we going to meet at the state level, working with DWR, Cal OES, but also, you know, working with the locals, working through Sigma, other efforts to really address institutional fragmentation in the state. So as Drinking Water Division looks at metrics of performance, you know, in our annual report and that sort of thing, I'd like to flag this as a performance metric of our efforts.
About that chair?
It's the engineer. I'm channeling Tam, clearly. I'm sure she appreciates that. But it's something I've always been really interested in too. But I think this is, and actually, you know, this report gets to that issue too in terms of tracking what we're doing and so just looking ahead, you know, how we might gauge our performance and not just in bean counting, but, you know, in really taking into account site-specific issues.
Question, you may have been getting to this and I may have missed it. What's the reason why the whole 15 wasn't subscribed? Do people just not apply or what?
Yeah, Damon can answer, but I mean, basically
We're not the only funding source, which you've
yeah, we're not the only
said.
funding source, and the funding didn't fit our particular need, but I think there was a general decline. I'll let Damon comment on that. On, you know, the first year drought we saw, well, and I shouldn't say the first year, but 2014 was when it really hit. Those systems collapsed big time. We did a whole bunch of work, and then it has tapered off over the last couple of years, so go ahead.
I think majority of the demand's been on the contamination side as of late. This year anyways, since I've been here, we've gotten a number of contamination projects, and that's why that funding has almost, you know, evaporated.
Right, and then we can start using the CAA funds for that again next year, right? So, good.
Right, so our...
Always appreciate it. I mean, that's more of a nexus with what cleanup and abatement account is for, you know, and this was, so actually I think that's a positive trend.
So just taking a look forward, So under the Budget Act of 2016, SB
I just
82
want to know why a guy in a business suit is standing in a field with the binoculars. He's not like birding during the workday, or is he? Sorry.
the only picture I could find. So under the Budget Act of 2016, SB 826 appropriated another $15 million for drought-related emergencies or threatened emergencies for this fiscal year, and that funding has an encumbrance deadline of June 30th, 2017. So we have just under a year to get projects under agreement. And also, in addition, Trailer Bill SB 828 appropriated $10 million to the State Water Board for establishing a program to award grants to public schools for improving access to safe drinking water through the installation of water bottle filling stations as well as point-of-use devices. However, staff will need time to develop procedures and guidelines before these funds can be administered, and those guidelines will be brought forward for your consideration.
What's your timeline on that?
Yeah, let me answer that, Damon, so I get in trouble, not you. So the key point on this one is to know that, you know, how this was put in the trailer bill and got mashed around in the legislative process is we got zero staff or staff funding for the program. So we'll be borrowing to do that, and I've had conversations with Community Water Center and others about it. And knowing that the schools are probably one of our hardest clients to work with. And there's legitimate reasons for that, but they're just a hard client to deal with. They have a lot on their plate, obviously, as of being their primary mission, being education, not, you know, providing the facilities and stuff that, you know, we're going to try to aid them with. So right now, my guess is that we're going to spin off a staff from somewhere, and I'm going to work on putting together guidelines, which will be kind of brand new in this avenue. The grants are going to have to come from us to each school, so it's going to be a lot of work. Originally, as this was envisioned, is we would do kind of like we're doing with the private well program, where we could list nonprofit helps and get them kind of quicker into the field and do, you know, only a few financial assistance agreements on our part, which would then disperse out, but that doesn't work out the way the appropriation was finally made. So it'll be independent appropriations from us to each school, which means we'll have to deal with each school. So I'm thinking we'll have the guidelines all adopted by spring, and hopefully seek an appropriation of staff to administer the program come July, and then be off to the races next summer with doing the actual grants. So the appropriation is a general fund appropriation in statute, which means that it has a 3-year to encumber, 2-year to expend automatically unless stated otherwise. So we do have some time with this money, different than the Budget Act appropriation above for the clean abatement account.
Just to keep a date in mind, the Safe Drinking Water, or the Drinking Water Week, is sometime in May. I'll have to confirm exactly when. And during that week, there is a tap water drinking day. There's a day that celebrates tap water devices like this. And I know that there's been some activity in Southern California, in Los Angeles in particular. But AWWA has been very, very active in trying to push this into other venues all over California. So I will get that date for you. Cindy knows it as well, and maybe we can be ready for an announcement of some sort, you know, in anticipation that we might have something by the.
Sure, that'd be something to target for sure.
Okay.
Do a follow-up, just so I understand the timeline, why it's so long. You don't have to explain. I just want to see it, why it would take that long.
Yeah, sure.
So also we're, because the existing drinking water emergency funding program guidelines, which were adopted last May of 2015, because those don't have the authority for administering this newly appropriated funding, we're proposing an item on July 19th, which will aim to accomplish 2 things. One, the item will request the board's authorization to allow the existing guidelines as well as the delegated authority that was approved for the AB 91 funding to apply to the newly appropriated funds until we can amend those guidelines. And the second thing it will accomplish is request the board's authorization for allocating funds from the cleanup and abatement account to assist disadvantaged communities with a contaminated water supply. And August 16th is the tentative date that we have set there for bringing an item to amend those guidelines and for your consideration. And those will incorporate the new $15 million and any funding that you approve on July 19th. And that's the end of our presentation, and if you have any other further questions.
Thanks for bringing it to us. We've had like pieces of the briefings on the response. This is a good piece, so thank you. Anything else? Okay. Anything else on drought before we move to the next item? All right, Sac River temperature management. Folks on that? Oh, good, Carl. Excellent.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and board members. I'm Diane Riddle. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Bay Delta and Hearing section. With me today are Rich Sikowski from the Division of Water Rights and Engineer in the Bay Delta section, Ron Milligan with the Bureau of Reclamation, and Carl Wilcox with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'll provide a brief introduction, then I'll turn it over to Ron to provide some details regarding this item. So just as a little bit of background, I wanted to refer back to the requirements for the temperature management plan. As you're aware, and we've gone over in the past, State Water Board Order 90-5 requires the Bureau of Reclamation to meet a daily average temperature of 56 degrees Fahrenheit on the Sacramento River at Red Bluff during periods when higher temperatures will be detrimental to fisheries. In particular, the time periods we focus on are generally the summer time period and the fall. That order allows the temperature compliance point to be moved upstream upon concurrence of the fishery agencies and the State Water Board. The order also requires planning, monitoring, and reporting, and includes other ramping rate requirements, and that no temperature actions impact the Trinity system. So as you'll also recall, at the end of last year, we issued an order on reconsideration of the temporary urgency orders that were issued in 2015, and one of the requirements in that order was for the Bureau of Reclamation to do a number of different things related to temperature in response to the poor conditions that occurred in 2014 and 2015. One of those was for early development of a temperature management plan for a workshop in March, which we held, and some specific requirements related to the temperature management plan, that it not impact red dewatering, stranding, or have other redirected impacts to Sacramento or Trinity River salmonids. It also required that the Bureau engage in stakeholder outreach, some regular reevaluation of the temperature management plan, and an issue that's now moot, but we weren't sure was going to be moot at the time, was a minimum end of October storage level. So I'm not going to go into the details of the temperature management plan because I think Ron is going to do that. It was submitted after a number of discussions to refine the plan to NIMS on June 27th. It was just submitted to us last night. It's essentially, it is, I think, identical to the plan that was submitted to NIMS on June 27th. There are some details related to the plan here, but I think that Ron is going to go into those, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. The flow levels are provided in that
when Ron is.
What's that? I'm not sure Ron has this chart in his presentation, so if we want to refer back to it, we can pull this up when he's going through things. The flow levels are indicated, the Keswick average releases on the top line of the table. It goes from 9,000 CFS in June to 10,005 in July, down to 10,000 in August, 9,000 in September, 6,500 in October, and the associated modeled resulting temperatures from, I believe that's from the June 7th run of the temperature model, are indicated below. And there are a number of different provisions related to the temperature management plan that have been developed to ensure that we don't have the type of temperature issues that occurred for the past 2 years. And I believe Ron will go into more detail related to those. But they add some rigor to the plan to ensure that we're assessing on a regular basis how we're doing with meeting temperatures and our ability to meet temperatures throughout the season. So this is just some more information I think Ron's going to go into, and just for a little bit of background, Carl can go into this as well. NIMS and DFW have concurred with the temperature management plan, NIMS on the 28th of June, and DFW on the 29th of June, and largely as a result of the additional conditions that have been added to the plan for regular assessment on a weekly basis. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Ron to provide more details.
Hi, I'm Ron Milligan, Bureau Reclamation. I guess this might be the irregular drought update portion of our program, but maybe before I go to some of the slides that I provided, maybe we go back to slide 4 here, and we can kind of talk about, Diane did a good job of kind of getting some of the let's say, the more numerics that are currently in the plan, and then we can talk about that. We've got a couple of the products that represent kind of how we're working through this. A number, process-wise or overall metrics are somewhat similar to what we've been using in the past, but I think we're going to be looking at these in a much finer time step just to make sure that we're assessing as we go along, and a lot of discussion has gone into what are the right things that we should be looking at and tracking. Recognizing that our various tools have some air bounds around them and some uncertainties, so how do we grasp that and not get too far along in the season, particularly in this critical period during the summer, so that we've got an opportunity to make a course correction and fine-tuning as we go along. Recognizing that you can do pretty well in July temperature-wise, but maybe at the expense of your temperatures later in the fall. So we want to make sure that we don't have that kind of a problem. So this table at the top of this particular slide illustrates what, for the purposes of average flows for these particular months that are in the plan, I'll make a couple of fine-tuning to that. I recognize these are just average numbers to help with some volumetric calculations just to see where we end up as we move through the season. In the month of June, we had an average flow in some of the modeling work that was done early on as a snapshot based on this June 7 modeling effort, which was based on, at the time, very end of the month of May cold water pool and estimations of how we would project through the season. In this particular run, we had 9,000 CFS projected Keswick release. As we worked through the month and being very cautious, we went through, the average release in June was only about 8,500. So that in itself induced a little bit of change as we go, and I show you some of the current snapshots that we are as we get to the end of June. The 10,500 number for July, there'll be some, what we've discussed is we're going to treat that as a cap for the entire season. So one of the concerns that we've gotten input from and going into the season was a concern about having high flows in particularly July, and then as those work down, having the potential for red dewatering for winter run. So one way to mitigate that type of risk is to try to keep your flows as low as you can in July, which brackets a pretty key period of time when you have spawning, and really monitor your spawning and the reds, particularly at the fringe of the cross-section of the river. So the 10,005 in this plan is considered a cap for probably any time during the season, but most critically in the July period. We'll be working through with the August, September numbers a little bit in terms of, again, monitoring of the red setup as we go through. The October number is a representative of kind of a split average for the month from a volume standpoint, in that the strategy here is going to be, as we map the reds, particularly at the edges of the system, to be able to keep the flows up higher on the first half of the month, and then once we feel that that particular red has had its fry emerge from the red itself, then we're able to move the water down. And then ultimately in November, we'd like to have a rather stable flow from that point going forward for fall run Chinook salmon spawning of roughly 5,500 to 5,000 CFS. We're going to assess that as we get to the end of the season to see how storage of Shasta looks, but October is going to be a split month where we try to maintain a pretty stable flow coming out of September and then moving to a lower flow. There is some risk of some dewatering of fall run Chinook in this transitional period, but traditionally that's a fairly small component of the overall fall run spawning, and this is a trade-off in working with our colleagues at the fish agencies as to how to deal with the concern of not dewatering on the winter run side and potentially doing some dewatering in the fall run. And given the critical nature of winter run this year, the coin flip goes over to the winter run in this case. But this is where the monitoring and the increased monitoring over the last couple of years is going to be really important, so that we know that we're not taking a risk there that we don't need to take. The temperatures that you see here are just kind of average for the month. They're kind of meant to kind of give us an idea of comparisons when we were looking at some different things. We will be having a proposal where 56 daily average is the prime driver of a temperature compliance point at Balls Ferry, and that we'd be maintaining that through the season. Obviously, given this chart, Balls Ferry on average is probably going to be below that, but this is a daily metric, and that will continue. And when I show you a graph, you'll kind of see that there's potential variations, obviously, with the weather. But this was, sure.
Why does the average go down during the hotter months of the summer? Is it that you're releasing more? And so it's cooler at that point on the river?
And well, this is an interesting graphic. June it's a combination, particularly at Balls Ferry, if that's the line you're looking at. Balls Ferry with the lower flows tends to be a little more difficult because the smaller temporal volume heats up a little bit as you go downstream. So in this particular case, it was fairly close, but August, as you get into August, September, you start seeing less heating because of less daylight hours, and the angle of the sun becomes critical. So we might think of August as a hotter month and certainly as a peak daily, but the amount of daylight hours and the heating component of the angle of the sun is also a critical one. And we can talk a little bit about, I'll point this out when we kind of show the seasonal temperatures. Which is a little counterintuitive for us as we just think about our wardrobe day to day. Keswick temperatures are, just as a point of reference, we've kind of used that as kind of a set point here for a seasonal strategy. 52.4 roughly was how we've constructed this particular run. And we can talk a little more about that. If I go back to when we had this discussion back in March, late March, when we still thought we were still going to see a nice projection of a lot of water and inflow into Shasta, the mauling runs we were doing that time were about 52.1 to 52.0. So the hydrology and just the kind of settling of that, manifests itself in about a 0.3 to 0.4 temperature that you can manage out of Keswick. with all its various mixing. And actually, these releases are very close to what we were talking about as a summertime release pattern back in March. Now, these have some ancillary water supply implications because you don't have all the other benefits that we may have envisioned in March in terms of the system. But from a release out of the upper Shasta kind of Trinity complex, the Sacramento River, these are very close to those release patterns. So again, 56 degrees daily average temperature, Balls Ferry is how we're going to kind of work this, but we are going to give a great deal of consideration as we look at the temperature regime where the reds are located. And as I get to my slides, we'll talk about the spatial difference between Balls Ferry as a more traditional compliance point and kind of also thinking more smartly about where the reds are and the temperature regime there. We also are going to do a great deal of tracking. One of the questions is, well, we have a tool. This whole plan is, in essence, built around ideas to how you consume the cold water pool through the summer and into the fall. Is there a mechanism to monitor that progress? And is your projections modeling-wise on track as well? So we are going to take weekly profile readings at Shasta for the cold water pool. And we've committed to take that weekly information and to run it through the modeling tool on a weekly basis, as opposed to maybe a monthly basis or every 2-week pattern. And one of the key metrics we're going to monitor is the volume of water that's less than 49 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to be looking at the entire cold water pool, but as a representative sample of just the progression of utilization of the cold water pool, we've selected kind of the 49-degree volume. And we're going to watch that as a key metric as we go month to month, or week to week, excuse me. And if we're not within 95% of that, meaning we're lower than that number, it's great to have more than that at a particular point in time. That's a signal that we need to reassess where we are. And if that happens July 10th, then that's warrants a discussion that may be different than September 10th, but we still need to have that discussion and figure out, do we need to make any course corrections? So 3 things we're going to be looking at on a weekly basis and talking with our colleagues at the fishery agencies is A, the monitoring of this cold water pool in terms of just a straight volume. No real modeling involved there, but tracking and comparing it to this June 7th model run. The second thing is actually putting whatever the latest profile is at the time, running that model and verifying 2 things. A, can we continue to meet 56 degrees at Balls Ferry for the remainder of the season? So validating that assumption. And secondly, a key thing, as we've talked about a number of times, is when do you fully utilize the side gate operations at Shasta, with the objective of wanting to keep that in the October timeframe. So we're not building a plan around doing that, let's say, in middle of September. So this model run had full side gate operations on the 9th of October. So we've selected that date. So at any particular model run, if that date of when those gates would be needed in its full construct sooner than October 9th, then we need to think about, do we need to make a course correction? So those are the 3 things on a weekly basis where we're going to be monitoring. And I can show you a little bit of the products that we're using to generate that and walk this through. So if we are less than, the 49-degree volume of water isn't tracking according to the forecast, and we kind of have an error bound of for some kind of reasonable trajectory, let's say it's 95%, we'll make an initial reduction of releases at Keswick of 1,000 CFS and assess where the heck we are, because it could be just an anomaly in the reading, but we'll continue to look at that. So we'll make a cut and then assemble the directors, and depending on when and if that happens and when it happens to be able to assess, do we have a big problem, a small problem, or a non-problem at that point?
Just, I know you may get to this in this. As I understand it, part of this agreement is if because of the concerns with modeling, which is not an easy thing to do. I know we're critical, but it's been off, and we've been caught flat-footed the last couple of years. Basically and Carl, you can answer this if you prefer, but as I understand the construct, it's like, here are the numbers, here's the target. If it looks like we're off, automatically 1,000 happens. If it's a bigger deal, you have a meeting. Do I have that right?
Correct. Actually,
The automatic versus discussing it all the way through
the
seems to be
1,000 is an
significant.
automatic, and I'll put an and, we're going to have a meeting to
And have a
see
meeting.
if we need to do more than that.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood.
And then the 1,000 may be, let's say we're within 94% of the cold water pool. We'll make the cut of 1,000 CFS and then assess the other two things I talked about, which is, are we still, even though that volume is slightly smaller than we thought, can we still hit the objectives we were talking about? And that may depend on the timing as well, as how close we are. And I'll kind of give you an idea as to just how small or large these numbers are in a relative sense. So I think that there's the make the cut operationally and then get everybody together and really assess where we're at is the component. But there is a kind of a automatic make a cut and get on top of this just to make sure we don't have an issue that's spinning quickly out of control. I will just as a point of reference to, and I'll probably do this a couple times with some of the data, is that these Keswick releases in this 52.4 range are considerably cooler than we've seen the last couple of years, where we were probably much, maybe 3 to 4 degrees warmer through the entire summer. So we are in a different spot in terms of that as well. But we still want to be able to make sure that we can maintain obviously, from what we're seeing with some of the updated survival numbers in terms of, or temperature-related mortality modeling, is that it's really important to keep the temperature constant and hold it through the season. Kind of nice to be cool up front, but you kind of lose a lot of the benefits of that if you end up warmer in the fall. So it's really kind of, and a lot of the dynamics of this are built around, hey, are we going to be able to hold on to this regime as we go through the entire season? So on the first part, as I said, in the month of June, on average, we were less than the 9,000 and want to be closer to the 10,500, which is a cap for the month of July. And certainly there's a lot of needs for the water to run the system. So one of the critical pieces here is how do you get from 9,000 CFS up to 10,005? And so one of the key components here is to do what I've described on this weekly basis, make sure that everything's progressing, and we've broken this into 2 walk-up chunks as we go through from 9,000, which we were at roughly, as a Keswick release, the 3rd week in June, to take it up last week, 750 CFS, so we went through the process. Everything seemed to be working very well, added 750 CFS, and then this week we're going to do the same thing. And if everything seems to track, we'll add another 750 CFS in June, and that would more or less be the, we're at our cap number. So everything from here is a matter of when and how you go and walk down the flows, releases from this spot. But there's a kind of ramping up component of this as well. We are working very closely, and I'll just say this, that there's part of the benefits of this plant creates a foundation. We're still working with a number of parties to try to find some additional outflow that would be beneficial to delta pelagic species, given the very low numbers of a number of key species this year. And even coming through the spring and into the summer. So there's a couple of potential options there for some water purchases and some other operational things that are useful, but they kind of have to get built on something that we think has some stability as it relates to Sacramento River operations. And this is part of where we think that the construct that we have, if we can continue to execute on it, will allow us to do that. In addition to this, we'll talk a little more that, we talked about, this is 56 daily average temperature is our compliance point, very typical to 90-5, but there's a lot of thinking that another metric that's very key, closer to where you see spawning occur, is a 55 degree on a daily maximum temperature that would be, certainly in the literature, a better way to go. And there's some EPA objectives that talk about 55 degrees on a 7-day average of just the maximum temperatures. So in a place like Reading, that's a fairly formidable objective to try to meet. But we are going to be monitoring that, and we have set up a lot of our reporting on a daily basis on our Operation Office website to capture a lot of this. It looks like a wall of numbers, but we are tracking both the 55 daily maximum objective at some key locations that are very close to where the spawning is occurring, as well as what's happening down at Balls Ferry. So if we get very close or just nudging the Balls Ferry objective, then there's some additional strategies as to, okay, make sure that these particular locations on the daily max, that you're taking some actions to basically get some more cold water at this key location to carry you through any particular heat waves where it's going to be a little bit harder at Balls Ferry. I think if we switch to the other presentation, we can hit some of those, maybe illustrate a couple of those points. Well, here's a picture of Shasta Lake at Dam here. Just kind of reacquaint yourself with the penstocks of the power plant. And, again, just to remind ourselves the trajectory we've had with storage. So in December, January, we weren't looking a whole lot better than we were a year ago. And those weren't going to be very good numbers. And then mid-March saw a pretty rapid increase in storage, and then that kind of slowed down a little bit. But we're still above normal average location for storage at this point, just a little bit below 3.9 million acre feet. The current makeup of the cold water pool is somewhat looking at it in isolation, say, well, that's fairly typical of it setting up warming from the top with a volume of colder water at the bottom, but those kind of trending towards lower levels as you move towards October, November. And then in December, you'll see an inversion occur, and basically the lake the stratification disappears. Key component of this was, when we were talking in March, still a lot of inflow occurring and kind of a little bit of a bumpy ride is where do you settle with this key 48, between the 50 degree and the 48 degree water in the lake, because that's a key dynamic as to what you can perform with through the season. And looked like a really good number, then kind of a pretty good change, then kind of recovery, and then this is kind of settled out to a little bit flatter trajectory. The main concern was here that this was going to be trending much more down this direction. Let's say if it paralleled these trajectories, that was going to be a very difficult, obviously, temperature management run for the season. But we have seen a great deal of stability now. And then these kind of vertical lines here represent the increased density of when we're taking the profiles. So this is as of the profile that was taken on Tuesday. So this is hot off the presses, the latest version of this. Just to acquaint ourselves with locations here a little bit, Shasta Dam, so the cold water we're talking about is predominantly what we're mixing here within Shasta Lake. Keswick release point is all the way down here, much closer to Reading. So a lot of the question is, how do you mix the water, get it, and there's going to be some warming within Keswick, making that release to the river. And then a lot of the spawning is up in this area just around Reading, is where most of the reds are. And down here a ways is where Balls Ferry, Gillies Ferry are located. So this has been somewhere within this reach, traditionally has been target 56 degrees on a daily average. And depending where spawning occurs, you'll probably have cooler temperatures, and that's usually much more successful. But the old approach really did not target location of reds and temperatures. There was this kind of bracketing approach over the years that had been used.
How did that compare to last year and the year before on points?
Well, over the last couple of years, last year particularly, we were talking about because of the very limited cold water pool, looking at 57 degrees on an average up at the spawning area, so right in Reading. So as I said, this is considerably cooler than this, even in kind of the around the edges. I'll talk a little bit about what some of the mortality models are saying about this kind of time series of temperatures when we get to that point. But location-wise, as the drought has progressed, we've gone from places like the confluence with Clear Creek as a compliance point to last year even further upstream, trying to manage through the season. So last year we had a very high temperature at that particular point relative to what we're talking about this year. We're able to work that through the season on a constant manner without having run-ups in temperatures, but when you take that time series of temperatures through the temperature-related mortality models, you still don't get a very good result. So it's kind of cooler early, but warm, very warm later versus just pretty warm all through the season. Neither one gives you a very satisfactory answer.
Last time you were here, I asked you to walk me through the layers of conservatism, and what your thinking was. This is yet another layer.
This right now,
the compliance point.
The compliance point question, and actually kind of the dual, I'll call it, it's not really dual compliance points because that doesn't work very well, but it is a compliance point and a secondary objective that we're looking at on a daily basis. So as we make decisions in thinking about managing to Balls Ferry, we're also keeping in mind what does that mean in terms of temperatures at the spawning areas. And this is a balancing of looking at forecasts of temperature, whether air temperatures over a week ahead, and thinking about flows and your adjustments to temperatures at the control device to be able to anticipate where you're going. And you may have a strategy of, do I make a change today or do I wait 2 days? And if you're looking solely at Balls Ferry, for example, you may get one answer on that within that range, but the other one may be, if I'm looking at where the spawning area is specifically, I may say, that makes me lean a little bit to the other side of that. And there's some examples of where you might take the action a little earlier or potentially a little bit later, depending on how your temperatures are running at this very critical location. So it's an added dimension. I think another layer of which we'll kind of see a little bit of the benefits of that is assuming a very warm set of temperatures through the summer, which is, if it's a very warm summer from start to finish, that was a really smart thing to do. But you also pick up the benefits if you get 10-day periods that are more on the cool side. You kind of build up some benefits of that, and I think we've seen some of that already in some of what we've been monitoring. This is more of a schematic version of that reach of the river, so we can talk a little bit about location. So again, Balls Ferry down here, quite a bit downstream. The red dots represent over the last 6 years plus what we've seen so far this year in terms of kind of the places where we've seen spawning. Back in 2013, which was a bigger year kind of all the way around, there was one red that was quite a ways downstream that was found. But other than that, we've seen everything pretty much upstream of the confluence of Clear Creek, with the predominant volume of those being upstream of Highway 44 bridge. This year...
Well, that's a function of the smaller range with good temperatures.
It could be, but some of these are occurring when, it's also probably, I think, a function of the spine gravel, because the fish are kind of looking around at particular places before temperatures are necessarily that that critical. They don't necessarily know that it's going to get worse down the road. So, but I do think there's, and Carl can talk about this, but obviously the further upstream you go, the cooler the temperatures are. And there is at least gravel as you get closer up to the upper end, because that's a place where we've injected gravel into the system with the idea that it would move downstream. We have a couple years ago excuse me, I'm sorry, just downstream of Highway 44 bridge, a place called Painter's Riffle, a project that a number of folks have teamed in to do some work there, and we have seen some spawning there at that location this year. But we've only seen about 9 observed reds this year, which is a low number. And part of that, I think, may be just visibility in the river is not that great. But the carcass count surveys are also quite down. So the returns this year, a lot of indicators are this is a fairly low number year. So kind of ups the ante a bit in terms of being as successful as we can with temperatures. But the key here is, as we look at this, again, with the eye towards this area and this kind of 55 degree maximum daily temperatures, trying to work with that as best we can without necessarily compromising our season-wide strategy. So again, Balls Ferry 56 daily average, but with an eye towards this 55 degree maximum daily as well. This is a time series of temperatures at a couple places along the system. This represents what is in the temperature plan. This was a run that was done on June 7th using the end of May the cold water pool profile at Shasta, just to give us an indication as to a couple things. One is roughly what's the temperature. The blue line is the temperature release out of Keswick. Kind of illustrates the purple and green lines are the anticipated warming going downstream. Purple line being Balls Ferry, green line being Jellies Ferry. So it probably, for the most part, somewhere between those two places on any particular day is where you'll find the 56 degrees. But with the idea that we wanted to keep this below 56 degrees at any particular point in time. What this does mean is that the red line, which is the kind of combined temperature through the control device at Shasta, is roughly 50 degrees through much of the season. So that's the thing that equates back to the profile. And so seeing 50, we kind of selected 49 degree water as this kind of tracker, knowing that that is kind of something that would be useful to say, gee, can I continue to meet 50 degrees? Is this release from Shasta with some combination of things getting us to 52 to 52 and a half as a release at Keswick, and then how does that play out as we go further downstream? So one of the things, as I talked about, we were going to do was on a weekly basis take a new profile and run it through the model and see where are we in terms of the two metrics, which was Balls Ferry at 56 degrees and where were we with the side gate operations. Excuse me, I'll go back a second. So if you could see at this particular location between September 29th and October 14th on this slide, this kind of little dip and then a kind of upward trend. That spot right, that little inflection point is when the model is assuming that we're going to full side gate operations. And at that point, it kind of rides the temperatures up through the rest of the season. And given the fact that you don't see a lot of warming of the river at that point, you kind of ride up these projected temperatures as you go forward. Again, another point of conservative is we've used a very warm set of ambient temperatures and warming factors through this entire simulation. So again, if we find that it's cooler for particular periods of time, then we can probably be a little bit warmer with our release temperatures to get the same outcome. When we fast forward to the work that we did last Wednesday in terms of the weekly progression, so this was part of the product set to make the decision point, can we add another 750 CFS into the Keswick release schedule? This was the run that we did. Again, this is using on the 27th, we did the profile at Shasta. Put this into the run, again, keeping roughly 50 degrees. Massage this a little bit to make sure, particularly in the July time frame and right up to the beginning of August, to make sure we kept these peaks, at or below 56 degrees. And then see how we end up having some additional cushion as we go further through the season, as we kind of hold that. But the good news is that this stays within the 56, and now the performance here at the end of the season is getting better.
So this is just the lines you're showing us are with the proposal, but if it's wrong, I know I keep coming back to this point because I'm not sure folks got this next week, the releases will go down to preserve more cold water pools. So this is what the model you have right now projects.
Correct. So this was one of the things that we would look at to say, does the model say, is it giving us a different answer than we had anticipated? And the answer in this case is, well, yes, it is, but it's suggesting that it's better than we thought it might have been a couple of weeks earlier.
One thing I noticed, that peak you pointed out in the last model run, with this updated model run, it shifted at least a week or two later as far as the side gate peak.
Yeah, so one of the things we tried to include, this is actually doing a side gate or anticipating side gates not till October 25th, which is probably a little bit late in the game. So this is a question where if we could get through the month of July into August, and it held just like this, for example, then this may be a point in time where you say, gee, that's a very late side gate operation. And given we've got temperatures below 56, you might consider moving your compliance point down to Ball's Ferry, or excuse me, down to Jelly's Ferry, for example. That'd be a nice problem to have, but this particular, looking just ahead for the few weeks ahead of us, 56 at Ball's Ferry seems like the right place to work towards in the monitoring. So as we kind of toggle between this, you could see that the higher temperatures are probably coming up here, probably not making a big difference on the river, but as you get to this particular run, we find that that's pushed out further and you don't have that kind of phenomenon at all. You've kind of wiped that out. So that was those were two checks in the positive trajectory in the right place. So one of the things, well, why is that happening? And here is kind of the third point that we're tracking. The green line here represents from that June 7th model run. It has part of the output, what did it expect the cold water pool to look like as it progressed through time? So we've taken the data from that and kind of plotted out this 49-degree boundary line within terms of a volume and tracked it through the rest of the season. And this would be how the model would see the utilization of the cold water pool. And we've also added to that well, what's 95% of that volume? So obviously, as you get out here towards the end, 5% of a smaller number is a pretty small number. But this kind of gives you an idea of the volume range that we have. The solid line up here represents, as we've gone these last 4 weekly measurements, is based on that particular profile, where does that boundary occur? And this is the thing we're checking. And what we've seen is starting up in here, where these lines were kind of close together, we picked up a little bit of volume there per se. Then we saw a little bit more, and now we're kind of tracking in a place where we've got a bit of a buffer in terms of this trajectory and where this is going. And so when you put this data as a whole, and if I take this concept to a family of lines, in this particular case, the 52 degree, the 50, this 49, and the 48 degree trajectory, both in terms of what the model would see it kind of coming together and where we're at, we're finding that we're seeing that we've got a little bit better cold water pool, and which is a good thing, because this allows us to have a little more confidence that even though these may trend closer to the lines, it still means we have some buffer to work with. And so one of the questions, well, why is that happening? And it's a couple things. One is we've had some spurts of cooler weather, which we've been able to work with. And because of that, we've been able to exercise the utilization of the upper parts of the gates at Shasta. So to talk about that, I'll just come to this slide real quick. Here's the latest profile. Worked more based on elevation as opposed to volume. A lot of what we do is kind of stack in terms of volume, but in the terms of elevation, which is probably critical to the control device, we're still able to, because this is fairly cool water at the middle gates, which is where we've had now 4 gates open, still able to mix some of this water with some of the upper gates. Now this, in a warmer scenario, would not be something we could typically do. So we've been drafting at this colder volume range considerably less than what the model would have assumed given the temperatures that we had asked it to think about in terms of operations. And actually, given the week ahead as being fairly cool by Reading standards, we've actually opened another one. We've actually gone backwards in the sense of, in a good way, backwards to open one more of the upper gates to kind of do a little more blending, which then takes less out of this. And if the forecasts hold where this extends into the middle of next week, we may take and actually do some closing of one of these middle gates as well. So we are exercising the gate considerably more than the model would. The model is pretty linear in its progression through time of this, but we're picking and choosing our opportunities with the weather to be able to stretch this even further. So we've kind of seen that manifest itself in the cold water pool a bit. The other thing I would say with this is and this is just the advantages of watching this very closely, is just being able to monitor these things day to day and seeing the shifting of what's actually going through the actual power plant, and to be able to say, gee, I see a trend there developing. So it's hard to understand all the currents that are in something of this large. So we kind of ride that until it starts to shift. And by having staff watch it very closely 24/7, we're able to stretch a little more performance out of the system. So what we see here is just one of the products that we're doing like 5 pages on a daily basis of what we're seeing with temperatures up and down the river, which is an expansion of what we've done in the past. So what you see here is, and this is just for the month of July so far, is the dotted line at the top is basically Reading air temperature, both what we've seen and then the 7-day ahead forecast. So you could see that we had a pretty warm spell, but now we're coming down with at least a forecast that's probably a bit cooler. Here's Ball's Ferry, mean daily temperature. It's been tracking, and it's been a good, right now we're looking at about a degree cooler than the objective. Where when we were at the higher temperatures here at the end of June, we had one day that was right at 56 degrees, but that's the objective. So we're seeing there's a little bit of ability here. So what you see now is us taking the temperatures at Keswick and through the control device at Shasta and trying to warm that a little bit. And that's by manipulating those gates, knowing we've got cool weather and some cushion built up at Balls Ferry. So by doing this, we're able to, with these two numbers, get this nudged up a little bit. But we're also looking at these two locations, which is SAC and CCR, which are bracketing the current spawning location. So we're keeping an eye on that as well, just to make sure that we're not creating as a bubble between those two spots, getting too close to the 55 daily average. So these are mean daily temperatures. We've also added a page of data just to look at daily maximums at this critical location. So 55 degrees, we kind of just put the line on there. This is near Clear Creek. This is near Highway 44 Bridge in town at Reading. And you can see that we're 55 daily max temperatures was kind of an objective. We've got a good 2-3 degrees of, depending on where a red is, somewhere between these two lines, maybe 2 to 3 degrees of buffer there as well right now. And we were also tracking that as the 7-day average of that number. So these are daily numbers, the max each day. And, we got cooling trends, so we're coming kind of down off of that. So we've got a little bit of that metric to work with as well. So these are the things that we're looking at. Now, when we get 10 days of really, really high temperatures here, then we're going to have to exercise the control device, get some cold water through the system, and be monitoring, again, these two locations pretty critically. So that's the game plan. So where we're at right now is folks in my office, as we're talking about the process for that next 750 CFS release, is we've distributed to folks that profile that we just did. So backing up, so the products that we would typically be doing is this new profile with the next week's version of this, which was done on yesterday. Plus, we're updating the model run, which should be an update of this particular product with that new data to see, again, that can it hold the 56 degrees at Balls Ferry, and checking that particular date. In this run, we're at the 25th of October in terms of the side gate, so checking to make sure that's still working. And then we've already talked about this graph, which is that, yeah, we still have a buffer of this volume that we're working with. So this is actually trending in a manner that if we can kind of keep that going, then we're going to have ourselves with a good buffer as well in terms of that cold water pool, that then we can decide how we want to utilize that to kind of close out the season. And the decision point will be made probably on Friday. Is it a prudent action to be able to go up to the next 750 CFS at Keswick? And so kind of per the plan, we'd have this discussion, how to look at all these things that we just talked about and look at the week ahead temperatures, which in this particular case is a cooler forecast, and then make the final decision, is it okay to add the 750? And then the next week, we'll start this all over again and make sure that we're tracking. And if we get something that goes below this green line, that this went like this, even if that made a big chunk, that's going to get our attention. Say, gee, what's causing that? And do we need to rethink our strategy? So in a nutshell, that's kind of the process that we're on.
You mentioned gravel. Is there adequate gravel in the spawning areas?
Well, maybe that's more Carl's, but I would say given the fewer number of fish that we're seeing, I don't know that gravel is the limiting factor right now. I think fish are probably, we certainly like to see more fish, but gravel has always been something that we've been working on.
Yeah. So there are a number of Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There are a number of proposals to do some enhancements, particularly in the spawning reach, but Ron pointed out that the Painter's Riffle restoration, which was done the year before last and was present last year, and we've seen some spawning on that. 2 of the reds are there, and that's just below the Highway 44 bridge. There are also some proposals that I think will be coming out as part of a salmon recovery effort done in conjunction with the Bureau, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the settlement contractors to look at getting more habitat improvements, particularly in these upper reaches, that can improve the habitat. But right now, with the low numbers, I don't think spawning habitat's the limiting factor.
I'd like to get some more information on that at some point, maybe in a future presentation. I don't know that necessarily it would have to be as part of the drought presentation, but just more information on that effort and others that are underway to address habitat conditions, and an overview, status of the projects, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that'll be possible, and maybe later in the month. I think we're getting pretty close to settling on what those things are, and there should be something to share more broadly.
The other question that I had was on monitoring. It looks like there's a lot more monitoring going on, and so just because this is something that's going to be with us for a long time, do you have the funding for the monitoring? What's the source of funding, and is it coming out of the Bureau, or is it in conjunction with the department and the fish agencies?
Well, a lot of that work's being done by State Fish and Wildlife, and Carl, you had some drought-related money.
Yeah, well, certainly the increased monitoring in the reservoir is the Bureau's effort. We continue to have field crews out working to monitor both red location, carcass counts, and those kinds of things, plus some site-specific temperature monitoring. And we are going to be putting out recorders, not that they're real-time, but we're going to download them on a regular basis to look at temperatures, particularly as they relate to the 55 7-day maximum average. Near the Cypress Bridge, which is below Highway 44 and below Painter's Riffle. So we'll be able to look at some additional information with regard to that.
Drought funding,
this point,
or is it a source of ongoing
it's
funds?
been drought funding to date, and we'll have to work on longer-term funding, but we have funding through this year.
Thanks for joining us, Carl. I was looking at that data that Ron showed earlier about the number of reds, and I noticed that the year 2011 kind of had low fish, or had low red counts, and that was, of course, a high hydrology year. Is there any loose correlation or explanation why there'd be less fish on a higher flow year?
Well, that's a product of 2 to 3 years before. So if you look at those 2011 fish, they were the product of 2009, and 2009 was not a good year. So you're going to see less returns.
Thank you for clarifying.
That's what we're experiencing this year. We're seeing fish from 2013 coming back.
Good. One challenge last year, I would just note that I'm struck by how, it's such a modified system, just taking a step back, and how these efforts this year, they're fairly positive in terms of being on top of information. It's like a process control for this natural system, in terms of what gate operation works, what the air temperatures are, and the resulting water temperature. So I believe you all have taken a great step in terms of more of a needed process control for this system to achieve the goals and have headroom, as we talked about last year, have that not be on the ragged edge, but have a buffer of a margin of safety in terms of the temperature management. So, I believe this represents a more conservative, sustainable approach. It just strikes me as like a process control. One of the challenges that was unexpected, I don't know that it was a huge issue, but it was sort of not a good timing issue last year, was the hydropower operations that happened in early August. And I don't have the full story in my mind as far as all that happened, but there was a pulse issue that disrupted some of the temperature goals as you were trying to manage them. Are you taking some steps this year to anticipate potential hydropower, unanticipated impacts, unintended consequences of hydropower operations?
Have done a great deal of discussion internally. There was, I think, the main fluctuation that we saw was related to some testing at the units at Keswick that are not in play this year because they are several years in between when those are required. But that's kind of in the SOP for future, is that let's keep an eye on that. We are being ultra sensitive about anything that relates to, obviously something the switchyard can switch things over between let's say the power plant tripping off that requires the gates to open at Keswick, because this is the barrier between the actual release to the river that the fish would feel. Certainly have the crews up there and the operators much more tuned in to the issues. So I don't anticipate that there's a problem, but if there is, that one thing that's very interesting at Keswick is that we've been very good about in getting our process down. If something happens either at the generator itself or in the switchyard that switches that off, to quickly be able to open the gates that would keep the flow to the river the same. The interesting thing about Keswick is over where the gates are located, they're kind of off to the side. It's a very rocky area here, and it cascades over some rocks that then go and find their way into the river, which works very well. When we've got, particularly not necessarily as much right now, but maybe even until spawning's fully worked through, if you have fish up migrating, they see the water on the rocks, and there's tend to get a jumper or two in there that like to go up and think that this is a way to go further upstream. And they find themselves into some of these pools on this rocky ledge. And it's really critical when you make the transition back to the generators when they come back online to make sure that you don't leave some fish, and make sure you're out there visually inspecting to make sure that you don't have stranding of some fish that have kind of decided, gee, here's a place I might want to continue to find a way upstream. And in the past we have discovered fish there, and if we find them, then we make a call out to State Fish and Game to be able to go out and actually do the rescue. So now when that happens, that's when you have people down in the basin, that requires a whole tag out process for safety for people being down there, that something doesn't happen and something trips off the grid and then the gates open back up again. So we've gotten everybody, just because of that concern, that if something does happen, we've got the right protocols to deal with it, but actually transitioning back out of it has its own set of things that you want to be particularly careful about. Just why I'm thinking about it as we work through this, the plans we've kind of presented and have talked about is kind of the global aspect of it. A piece of it that kind of also dovetails with the monitoring is watching how the spawning sets up and transition as we walk the flows down through the late summer into the fall is going to be critical. And we certainly, that is an area where we're going to have, pretty intense discussions amongst the field staff, both of them from a fishery, folks in the river, as well as the folks out at the project. And this is an area where we'd like to continue to get some input from our stakeholders about their concerns about dewatering, because we really want to try to minimize the dewatering aspects of this as we migrate from the winter run concern to the fall run. And we are committed to continue to do some outreach with various stakeholders still as we work through the final and ultimate implementation as we go through time with the plan. But you know, it's a pretty big chunk of stuff at this point, and you know, there's a couple of venues that we like to continue to exercise to be able to explain and answer questions. Uh, you know, beyond what the board may have, but as well for the stakeholders, as to what does this mean, whether you trigger some of the required reductions in releases, or how you're going to monitor going through the rest of the season.
And also, just my impressions are that, you know, if you look back at that one graph that shows the Shasta Reservoir elevations are quite high. They're above average this year. And yet we are having some struggles, you know, to reach the goals. Things are positive. You know, there's some headroom built in thanks to your efforts to do more updated monitoring and modeling, and then also having, you know, Fish and Wildlife and other agencies out there monitoring. So there's a great effort this year in a year of relative abundance. And yet, we're learning here collectively that we have to have a process control type approach to this system, even in years of relative abundance. Thank goodness for it, because it's giving you this opportunity to have some flexibility to try things and work with the agencies and the stakeholders. But I am struck by, you know, what level of effort is needed even a year of relative abundance. So, and you mentioned this is a big chunk to bite off on, you know, in terms of the agencies or all of us and our capabilities. But do you see work being done this year is really setting the stage for more, you know, efficient operations and using these lessons we're learning on process control and looking ahead, not having to expend maybe this all hands effort at this level in perpetuity?
Well, you know, obviously we are learning things, and you know, here we are. A lot of discussion we had was straddling: is it a Balls Ferry compliance point or something that's much closer to where spawning would occur, and what's the right metric there? And I think we're going to learn a lot this year as to what is the right size in terms of a metric that ultimately gravitates a little further upstream and is more keyed into where the spawning gravels are located and where we ultimately find the spawning. So that'll be an improvement. I think it'll be more streamlined, and as we discover what's the right measuring devices and continue to refine the whole array of tools, I think we'll be able to figure out how to do this in a year where it's not maybe as extreme as 2014, 2015, but certainly not as good as this year. And again, looking at the volumes, what struck me the other day, just looking at the volumes of cold water, I mean, the volumes of water at 50 degrees or 49 degrees is more volume than we had in the entire lake a year ago. And this idea of utilizing those upper shutters to kind of stretch our resource, we didn't have enough water in the lake to even utilize it. We kind of started out with the middle row of gates as our first run. So I think we need to almost familiarize ourselves with how the device can be utilized in this particular year. And again, a really key threshold is being able to get enough water in the lake and keep it there to be able to use this particular flexibility, because we're finding that this is a real key in stretching the resource. So there's a lot of things that we're picking up as we go. And I think the monitoring on the river as well is going to be kind of key as to what do we do and what do we want to keep in terms of into the future.
Ron mentioned it. Oh, sorry. Ron mentioned it, but the fact that you're seeing so few fish, you mentioned that the water's a little murky, and you know, hope springs eternal, but I sort of gave up hope as a strategy over the last 2 years on this, so that's why conservatism seems so important this year, and why I keep asking for what are the layers of conservatism in all of it. But talk about the fish counts and murkiness and all of that and the other factors. Clearly it's not just what happened in 2013, it's what's happening out in the ocean and all of that. But how are you all looking at it?
I think, we're tracking reds and as well as carcass counts. There have been carcasses detected upstream of ACID diversion, which indicates that there are fish farther up and probably in greater numbers potentially than what show up in the red counts. The other thing is that it's difficult, particularly at depth, and winter run tend to spawn in deeper water, to detect those reds. There's some conservatism built in there relative to the number of spawners in the river. The other thing that we've done this year is that we were having trouble catching enough naturally produced fish for the Livingston Stone hatchery activities. And so what we've done this year, and really getting relatively low numbers, less than 100,000 eggs. So this year, or this fall, or spring, we made the decision along with the National Marine Fisheries Service to include hatchery-reared winter run in the collections so that we could make the 200,000 production target. So that's been underway, and hopefully we'll get there. I'm not sure where we stand with that right now, but we have taken that action to increase the brood stock production so that we'll be able to release at least the base number that we have in the past. So the carcass counts are between the captures at the hatchery and the collection points and the carcass counts. Those are our best indicators probably of the number of fish that are present in the river and have spawned. And so we're seeing pretty low numbers in the carcass counts, but more than what the red surveys would indicate. So.
As something else to look at. Other questions before we go to public comment? Is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of the agreement? I mean, it felt like we had a standoff of sorts, and you all have seemed to come up with a trust but verify and act, as opposed to, I won't call it a hope and a prayer, but sort of hoping the models are right. I mean, it sounds like much more that weekly activity, all you're looking at, the automatic actions. But since you're the fish agency person, I really appreciate you coming. I've been frustrated at these that we haven't had folks from a fish agency here, so thank you, Carl, for coming. Just add your thoughts
Glad
on
to be here.
this.
It's been a really difficult 6 weeks preceding this, getting to that point. Certainly the concern about the model has been preeminent in the fishery agency concerns. We are developing tools, particularly the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Santa Cruz, to add an additional layer of temperature modeling, and particularly in the river, to give us a better idea of potential mortality. Some additional mortality models have been, an additional mortality model has been developed, which helps us understand what's going on. I think, the point that we've got to with the compliance point relative to maintaining the 7-day average daily maximum in the spawning reach was kind of the critical point, plus the weekly update on the temperature profile, the model runs, and being able to get together and discuss that and make decisions, plus the provisions to back things off if we're not achieving, or if the cold water pool is going below what was modeled. And fortunately, what we're seeing now is that we're above that and looks to be on a pretty good trend. The other element for the department in particular was the ability to get to a point where we could do something potentially for Delta smelt through this GCID pump out and sending water down through the Colusa Basin drain and into the Yola bypass to spur productivity improvements, particularly in the Cache Slough area. And that will also contribute to outflow. I think, well, the final details of additional augmentations of outflow haven't been worked out. I think from the department's perspective, we view it as critical to be able to maintain the low salinity zone into at least eastern Suisun Bay because of temperature issues, turbidity issues, potential food production, and habitat quality issues. And this is something that Delta Smelt haven't seen in 4 years. We have focused so much on winter run, but basically Delta Smelt have had very, very poor habitat conditions through the last 4 years. And it's evidenced by their abundance indicators. And this is an opportunity to actually do something that can hopefully improve their chance of rebounding somewhat in the fall and into the spawning season next year. So from our perspective, that was an important component. Since we're responsible for management of both species, it's been very difficult for us over the last couple of years to, understand that because of the actions, and that have been taken for winter run, that Delta Smelt and pelagic species in the Delta and the Delta as a whole are going to suffer. And that's, and I don't know that there was anything we really could have done about that, but that's just the situation we were in. So this is an opportunity to do that, and I think, we'll be working more on that as it relates to the coming years to try to improve conditions for Delta Smelt. We've had a good year, at least flow conditions in the Delta and habitat conditions in the Delta, and so we want to try to maintain that as best we can.
We have one speaker card? Just one? All right. Doug Obigi, Natural Resources Defense Council.
Good morning, Chair and members. Doug Obigi on behalf of the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's nice to be here to not be looking at a third year of extirpating winter run. But I do think that we need to step back a little bit, and I'd like to encourage you to really think about initiating proceeding to look back at decision or order 90-5 and see about how we do sort of systematize some of these decisions that are being made the last couple of years and the lessons learned. The species cannot handle what we've done the last couple of years, and we don't have a conflict between protections for winter run and Delta Smelt. What we do have is a system that is at the breaking point because we're taking so much water out of it. And it is a heavily engineered system. We found ways to minimize that and still be able to maintain a lot of water supply, but it's really showing its age and it's really falling apart. And we can't be wiping out 2 years of winter run and potentially wiping out Delta Smelt. We have a responsibility, all of us, to try to maintain our health and safety of our environment as well as our economy. And the trade-offs we've made have really hammered the wildlife the last couple of years. A couple things I want to really note. One is that while the operations do look better this year, they aren't inherently more conservative than what the biologists recommend. In fact, the daily average temperatures, 56 degrees, is not adequately protective, as NIMS and the other agencies have shown. And it's really this daily maximum that is really critically important. If the eggs or fry are in the water and it's 57, 58 degrees for 4 hours, you're causing mortality. And that daily average loses that. We're using 56-degree daily average as a temperature compliance point because it's easier to measure and manage to, but we have to move that further downstream so that the temperatures at the reds are much colder, because we will lose some of the winter run. We are seeing record low or near record low, both in the carcass surveys and in the red surveys for winter run this year. These are the fish that went out in 2013, so they've They face drought conditions in the rivers. They've faced a couple years in the ocean. We're not going to have many, if any, fish the next 2 years, so we really do have to protect this run. And there are lessons that we can learn. You know, Ron mentioned that it's really critical to maintain high levels in the reservoir as you go into the temperature compliance season so that you can have that flexibility of using the upper gates. That's why those releases in April and May from the reservoir are so critically important. And limiting those releases in the dry years is necessary, even if that impinges on senior water rights. There is a conflict there, and we need to make sure that we're planning for the next drought year with the lessons learned so that we're not falling into the trap of John Steinbeck and after the dry years end, we forget about the dry years. This is our opportunity to fix that and to really think about how we do this better and to have some accountability, frankly. You know, we've done things, we've all had to face some really tough decisions. We've made some choices. There were consequences to that, and we need to find a way to rebuild these native populations so that we can really go back to what the goal was in 2009 of we're going to improve water supply by improving environmental conditions. We've taken a huge step back on that, and it's going to have repercussions for years to come in terms of water supply. We need to own up to that and be honest about that. Otherwise, we're just going to see more attacks in Congress and elsewhere of ignoring the fact that we have an obligation to protect our natural environment and the jobs that depend on it. And finally, just one other thing to note is that with respect to Shasta management, it's not just about winter run. We also need to be thinking about spring run and fall run. And it's not just about red dewatering, but it's about temperature as well. And really how we manage this reservoir. There are much better ways that we can do it. We're learning a lot of lessons, and we really need to think about how we take the next step to use those lessons and make sure that we don't do this again when the next dry year comes, and potentially including next year. Thank you.
No, thank you. A
Yeah.
lot of very painful lessons learned, and that's definitely something we've taken to heart across the board. We have to do that.
Well, real quickly, you mentioned your recommendation to reopen 90-5, and so do you think that would be a way to memorialize some of what we're learning? And also, as far as what you heard today, do you see, you know, some improvements relative to the last couple of years that are notable and that we can build upon?
Let me take this in reverse order. I do see some improvements. I think we're having a lot better monitoring. We still have not fixed some of the major flaws in Reclamation's temperature model, but we have better information about where reds are located, about temperature in the river. We have much better temperature mortality model from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, the Martin model. And as Dee Dee noted, we do have concerns about how we fund that monitoring going forward because it has been short-term funding. So thinking about how we make sure that we have that in place for the next year. That said, you know, I think 90-5, if you look at it, 90-5 says we're supposed to maintain adequate temperatures down to Red Bluff. That we've cut that in half. If you look at the 2009 biological opinion, we were supposed to meet temperature compliance down at Balls Ferry something like 40, 50, 60% of the years. We haven't met that benchmark at all. We're falling woefully behind it. And so, you know, I think that looking at 90-5 is a way to get outside of just thinking about endangered species, but thinking about the whole suite of salmon and other species that depend on flows out of Shasta, and a way to memorialize some of these decision-making lessons learned and really have a better refinement and have new requirements for updating some of these models that really do need to be fixed.
We have to assume more bad years.
So we have to assume that there are bad years. We hope that we never have to use them. Thank you.
Rich and Diane, do you have any questions that you want to ask? Or anything?
No, I think we've been asking our questions along the way as the plan's been refined. Just to respond on the issue of the opening order 90-5, these are definitely issues that we're paying attention to and addressing in our phase 2 process. It may not be on the time frame that Doug is recommending, but these are certainly the types of issues we intend to address through that process. So we're not, we don't intend to use 90-5, I think, into the future as a primary mechanism for managing for temperature. We recognize that there's updates that need to happen to those requirements, and we've got the opportunity to do that in a comprehensive way through our phase 2 update process of the Bay Delta plan and the implementation efforts that occur with that plan.
Well, still going to be a buckle your seatbelts kind of a year, but at least the airbags aren't going to deploy. Hopefully it'll be all right. I'm still really thrown for a loop by the number of fish coming back. That is unfortunate in what otherwise could be a rebound kind of a situation. But
Good reminder too of the importance and the fragility of the downstream systems. You know, the salmon have been a great all hands challenge for everyone, and people have responded. But there's a whole system that we need to manage, and a natural heritage of the Bay Delta ecosystem that we need to pay attention to. So thanks, Carl, for bringing that up.
And this is a question for any or all of the four of you. If we're going to be handling 90-5 in phase 2, that's a long way off, and we'll have several years when, there could be dire conditions. And so what's the interim plan for this? I mean, is it more of the kind of work that Ron described today, which sounded really good?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody we don't intend to lose the lessons that we've learned over the past several years, and I would anticipate that we're all going to be looking at these kind of double checks as we develop plans into the future, and there may be opportunities to implement changes to phase 2 on a quicker time scale and in an interim way or through steps in the process of pieces at a time, those kind of things. So there's, we're looking at those kind of issues as well, ways to be more efficient in our implementation activities. And, I don't want to wish this on us, but there may be, if we have future drought years, there may be opportunities through other orders or, or regulations or, other things depending on how bad it may get into the future.
the updates, so it's just going to have to be all hands on deck for the duration, pretty much. So, all right, sobering, painful couple of years. Yes. Anything else? Thank you all. I'm glad you came up with something that creates a web of actions, and everybody's going to be holding hands and handling their fears.
The good part of doing this weekly is we can come to almost each board meeting and share where we are.
No, that's good. We need to be in it.
You're welcome. Anytime. It's great to hear all the efforts and the successes this year. Thank you.
Next item is a board member report.
I just have two reports. One, I attended the Malibu groundbreaking for the wastewater treatment plant that is being, it's phase 1 of 3 phases, but they did break ground, and I stood on the spot where they're going to put this, and this has been a long, long, long time in the making. And there was a very good crowd for something as esoteric as a groundbreaking of a sewage treatment plant, but it was people were celebrating. They were really quite happy. I reminded them that there is a phase 2 and a phase 3. They didn't particularly appreciate that, but it was very good. And Mark Gold was there, which was quite nice because he had been working on this when he was at Eula Bay, and then all of the supervisors were there, or not supervisors, but city council people were there from Malibu. So it was quite a celebration, and On the dais were myself, the mayor, and John Kimmerer from US EPA, and as well as Francine Diamond from the Water Board. So it was quite good. The second is I attended Region 7 board meeting, and while it was also very hot, they did. It was air conditioned inside, which was good. They approved the lamp with Imperial County, and the Imperial County fellow was the health department person was there for the county, and they were very, very proud of it. And so John, I would appreciate if once the lamps have been approved, and they are popping up on agendas throughout the state, to get a report back as to maybe even it could be in the executive director's report, but someplace where we can start to make some comparisons among the different ones, and because I don't want people to think we aren't paying attention to this.
On the 22nd, I attended the CV Salts workshop that Region 5 had. It was a full-day workshop, very well attended, and I've been going to quite a few of the meetings or calling in, so this was a good opportunity to, instead of being in the weeds, look at the big picture and hear what all the stakeholders had to say. A lot of stakeholder engagement. The board was very engaged. Of course, Carl Longley was very engaged. This is, has been his pet project for a long time. 4 board members were there, and it was just a really good discussion. There's still, a fair amount of work that needs to be done on it. But I think that the concept is starting to become a little more clear, and one of the concerns that I've been raising all along is how do you take it from this small group that's been working on this for a while, and they know and understand it really well, and translate it in such a way that others that need to be involved can understand what it is and why they need to be involved. And so this was, part of that process. I spoke to the American Pistachio Association on the 23rd, and talked a lot about drought and the Bay Delta planning process. And then on the 29th, Cal Water had their board of directors meeting in Sacramento, and so I spent some time with them talking about the urban conservation regulation, and got to hear from them on their perspective about implementation of our new standards. And then also they were looking for an update on the Bay Delta planning process. So talked to them about that, and it sounds like they would like to closely follow that.
Surprising to me, the folks who don't follow it when it has a direct impact on them. I don't know, maybe it makes their head hurt or something, but it's interesting.
Okay. All right. I've had a busy couple of weeks. I did attend the North Coast Regional Board meeting on June 16th, and they had a lot of NPDES permits on their agenda. And actually, the board was interested in the Eureka treatment plant issue, and looking at, it's one of the coastal treatment plants, and so there were a lot of good questions really from the board members about the timeline, because there was an improvement program that was staggered out to the year 2030, and some good questions about why it needs to take that long, and so it was just a little glimpse into those type of details. But from a civil engineering perspective, you can empathize with the time it takes to do this type of work. But
it's always more than people can believe.
Right.
Generally.
So it was a good spirited discussion. And then on June 17th to 24th, Secretary Karen Ross, the Department of Food and Agriculture, invited me and about a dozen other folks to go to Israel for what was called the Climate Smart Agriculture Tour or Mission to Israel. And it was a very packed agenda where we visited with a lot of folks the nation of Israel and Governor Brown and Prime Minister Netanyahu signed an MOU to cooperate on technology development and cooperation between Israel and California in 2014. And so this was Secretary Ross's follow-up on some visits that we had received from the nation of Israel. And so there's so much I could talk about. Won't go into great detail. But the folks that we visited with included Netafim, who really was in the kibbutz Hatzerim. It's where drip irrigation was invented. And it's discussed and there's a good book recently written by Seth Siegel called Let There Be Water. And everyone I asked in Israel, whether they were water utility folks, agricultural folks, all spectrum, believe it was an accurate portrayal of what's going on in Israel. And so it's really, you can think of it as an authoritative reference if you have detailed questions about how water's managed in Israel. But yeah, we met with companies that do agri-tech or really detailed work on trying to increase yields and reduce water use, have increased salt tolerance and all the issues that they're managing there. And then I had some influence on the agenda, and we met with the National Water Utility, Mekorot, which is kind of analogous to Metropolitan Water District in terms of being a large-scale wholesaler for 75% of the country. And so we got some insight into their perspective and how they have one set of water rates for the whole country and how they eventually evolved toward that. It was a long story, but they also were formed before the state of Israel, and so they developed the National Water Carrier System, which is analogous to our state and federal water projects. And so there's a lot of commonality in their water history. Their big project went online in the 60s, like our state water project. And so there's some interesting lessons to learn, and I won't go into the great detail on that. Couple of quick, so that was the water utility side and the agricultural side. And then we did drill down to Jerusalem, which is more of like a LA Department of Water and Power, a retailer, and how they're operating and integrated water management at that level. So some good lessons learned there. Partnerships with technology firms to develop leak detection and actually remediation technology in the pressurized distribution lines. It's real interesting that we could take advantage of in terms of partnership. Jerusalem has about 4% non-revenue water, 4%, as opposed to our typical in California is 20 to 30% non-revenue water based on leaks and things like that. And so you can look to them as on the spectrum of performance. They're kind of on the extreme. But they're instituting integrated systems that we could benefit from here to reach water efficiency goals. So there's a lot to say. It's a lot of parallels as far as the physiogeography of this nation, but it is 19 times smaller than California, and a fifth of the population of California. So. But they have some recent history that's really interesting to think about in terms of a national commitment to the desalination technology. And now it constitutes 27% of their water supply. And so only recently, in the last couple of years, are they in a position of water surplus, even in drought condition. And so they're working through how to manage that and what kind of environmental benefits they want to try to enhance. And so it's a very dynamic story in Israel. Things we can learn from, clearly things they can learn from us. And it's just a partnership that hopefully will yield fruit in the future. I want to thank Secretary Ross. She did a great job of putting together the delegation of really, they put the smart and climate smart mission, I think. These are really great folks that I was privileged to travel with, and I think collectively we learned a lot and were able to teach a lot as well. So I hope that's useful. And then finally, June 28th, I was privileged to attend a ribbon cutting dedication ceremony from the that was attended by Clint Eastwood, and it was for the Carmel River Floodplain Restoration Environmental Enhancement Project, where they were officially dedicating the land to the Big Sur Land Trust. And they hosted the event, and Supervisor Dave Potter was there from Monterey County, and of course our esteemed Secretary John Laird was there.
And Clint Eastwood?
And Clint and Maggie Eastwood, who generously donated this land, and in a very creative multi-benefit solution that is going to result in a great project. Right now it's agricultural lands that are former floodplain, so a lot of effort will be performed by the locals to transform this floodplain into a riparian ecosystem from an agricultural grassland. So people are excited about it, but the work is just beginning. Caltrans is involved too, and they're going to create a bridge, a causeway over the floodplain area along Highway 1, and so that's going to enable this system to function in the next flood years. When they're coming, I'm telling you, I can feel it. One of these years, the flood will come. All right, so that's it for my report. Thanks.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Tag teaming off that, you weren't here last time, so I just want to acknowledge your reconfirmation, which was an event attended by all, but happy you've got another 4-year lease on life. That's good for us and good for the state of California. So really glad. Now we're happy to be there. That's right. We had no discussions with each other about anything while we were there, just for the record. Just want you to know we all filed in. And just to follow on the Steve's report about Israel, I went to a Israel-California convening, and Steve's notes were really helpful to me, or else I would have really been even more blown away by what the Israelis have done, because I haven't spent quite as much time on their overall system as I have on Australia, and it is along a continuum compared to us, you're right. But really pretty impressive, and pretty impressive people. Secretary Ross opened it up along with someone from the Consul General's office, and then Tammy Shore from the Israeli Water Authority and I were the setup speakers, and then we had just a series of panels. But it was really impressive what they've done, and very instructive. You know, much more centralized control of water, of course, and but a much clearer sense of the value of water and how not to take it for granted, the role of rates in making that happen, and very strong rules about how water is used. There are a couple of arenas where they were interested in learning from us, where we actually are more advanced, the environmental issue clearly being one that they haven't factored into, both for, you know, where they started from an existential reason, but something they're interested in, stormwater management, although they do some, were 2 areas where there could be a lot of information exchange where we're not just listening. And I found, unlike some other meetings I've been at with folks from other countries, including Israel and Australia and everything, it was, I was really impressed at how they set the stage for really understanding, mutual understanding of each other. Most of the speakers were California speakers, but there are an awful lot of Israeli firms there. They have a much more active engagement in technological development, but again, it's a much more organized society than ours, no less fractious, perhaps a little more fractious. But it was inspiring to see the range of what you actually could do, even though we probably can't copy exactly what they've done. It was very instructive, and more importantly, I just thought it was a very, it was nice to sit and bask even for a day compared to a week in the way another player deals with these issues that are even more challenging than ours. So I found it therapeutic, but it was also really, really interesting. And I learned more than I thought I would, actually, both from your notes.
Yeah.
I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. So those are always good experiences.
The recycled water story is quite striking. You know, it's one of those that we wouldn't copy it all, but they used to use only 10-20% of their wastewater in about late 80s, and now they use 85%. And so they've completely flipped it in the course of 20, 30 years. And it was an infrastructure commitment at a national scale, and there's a parallel system of purple pipe, and 65% or more of agriculture is served including food crops, is served by recycled wastewater of different qualities. And but it's interesting, they don't do any indirect potable reuse. There is zero use of wastewater for groundwater aquifer recharge or that sort of thing like we see in Southern California and Orange County.
It's all desal. No. It's just interesting. Different topography too. But yeah, fascinating. All right. Well, thank you. We have a, I don't have the, there's a closed session. I'm just making sure there wasn't executive. We have a closed session item. I suggest we take a break for folks to get their lunch, unless people want to take a whole lunch hour, and meet at noon in wherever the designated spot is. Does that seem acceptable? Okay. See you all at noon. We are in brief recess until then.